Last night was the final of 12 Republican debates, and the first one that didn't immediately, descend into chaos and name calling and penis-sized comparisons. We saw a much more subdued and possibly heavily medicated Donald Trump, and we saw an actual comparison of ideas and politics. But Peter, at least when they attacked each other, it was entertaining. And last night we saw the candidates talk about how most Muslims hate America, defend violence against protesters at their rallies, threaten a trade war with China, shut down the idea of any peace in the Middle East, mock climate change. Didn't we just go from entertaining to terrifying?
Pretty much so, yeah. I mean, basically, the previous ones were evil craziness, and this one was just kind of quiet evil. In a way, absent the usual bombastic Trump remarks and the other guys kind of sparring with him, it really allowed us to focus on how completely insane these candidates actually are, including, the so-called normal one, Kasich.
Yeah, that was really the most stark position that I think most people don't realize is when everything gets toned down to Kasich's level, he's really nowhere less crazy than the other candidates, except maybe he's willing to accept that maybe some that people have contributed at least somewhat to global warming. So a lot of last night was focused on foreign policy, trade, terrorism, foreign relations. Having spent more than 2 decades in the State Department in Iraq, Peter, how would you rate last night's discussion on foreign policy?
Well, infantile, I can't really decide between the two. There's really two large overarching problems with what the Republicans call a foreign policy. I mean, the first is that their version of foreign policy is largely limited to how many conflicts can we start or enhance, and China and Israel. They seem to ignore the fact that the world is a large and complex place, and the United States has relations with 170 some countries and territories. We didn't hear a lot about, any of them. And again, this idea that there's really nothing but conflict that comprises American foreign policy. We heard John Kasich wanting to start a war in the Ukraine. We heard the candidates spar with one another about who would send more troops into the Middle East. And because it was Miami, we threw in a few Cuba references. But otherwise, it was childish, it was juvenile, and it was scary. These guys, one of those guys has a very decent chance of being president of the United States. And if he brings these ideas with him into the Oval Office, we start with the position that more fighting and more military are going to be the cornerstones of what we used to call foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, after most of these debates, what we come away with is talking about, did you hear what Trump said about this guy? Did you hear what he called him? But, this time it was subdued and we got to talk about, policies. And Donald Trump really didn't have a whole lot of substance behind his. Even Ted Cruz mocked him, saying we have to get beyond, Muslims bad, China bad. Eric, doesn't this subdued Donald Trump now risk being exposed as the substanceless candidate that he is?
Depends how he can spin it in the coming days. Media, Trump's always been very good at just kind of shrugging off those kind of criticisms and moving forward with his kind of Trumponian style of politics. When I look at Ted Cruz, I don't see a candidate that's necessarily the dominant foreign policy master of the United States. He's more of a constitutionalist. So I would argue too that Ted Cruz is equally as bad at foreign policy as Donald Trump. And then if I look at a guy like Kasich, he's a governor of his state, I don't see much there. And I could say the same about Rubio. So really, all four of them are pretty weak on foreign policy. I don't see any of them standing out.
Well, if you ask John Kasich, he was there in the room pretty much at every time anything substantive in foreign relations happened. What were you going to say, Peter?
Oh, I just think that it's important to review some of the things that were talked about yesterday. Partially because it's a reflection of what constitutes, CNN's journalism now, that these were topics discussed kind of calmly and rationally. And the other is, again, insights into the way that these folks' minds work. So we had a sincere question from CNN asking Donald Trump if he would still be in favor of killing the families of terrorists in some kind of retribution. And the other candidates were allowed to express opinions about that. We had discussions about torture and whether or not that might be a good idea. Kasich was allowed to say that he would like to give the Russians a bloody nose or punch them in the nose in the Ukraine. Donald Trump was allowed to repeat the same bizarre, false statements about ISIS having cages where they drown large groups of people simultaneously, and the usual things. This is quite a sad state of affairs when candidates for the presidency have a sincere, and in their sense, rational discussion about killing the relatives of terrorists.